What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be taking a deep dive into each of the main card fights taking place this weekend at UFC Fight Night Shevchenko versus Grasso, and we're going to be going into these matchups from a betting perspective. So hopefully you'll be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions, maybe even earn some extra cash. All of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today is backed up by many hours of research and 14 years of experience. I've been making money betting on the UFC for 14 years now. I am a bit of a dinosaur. I'm a lot older than I look. And so hopefully you'll find the information on each of these matchups very useful. Now next weekend, it's only a fight night card, but we've got a brilliant main event matchup between Rafael Fiziev and Mateusz Gamrot. If you'd like me to do a live stream on YouTube where we research that fight together as a group, hit the like button below, and if this video gets 150 likes, I will do that live stream next Monday. So hopefully you'll be able to go through that matchup and dig up a bet, because it's a 5-round fight as well between two really skilled fighters. You know, great grappler in Gamrot, great striker in Fiziev, great clash of styles. Be really interesting to research that fight as a group to see if we favour either guy and if either of them is worth a bet. What is particularly interesting about next week's main event between these two is that both guys are in the even money odds range, and as you know, if you watch my videos regularly, I love to bet fights in the even money odds range, because if you can just lean 60-40 one way or the other, you can usually find a pretty good position to put your money. So if you want that live stream, hit the like button below. 150 likes will get it going. But for now, we're focusing on this week's event, and the first fight we're going to be going through is Alexa Grasso versus Valentina Shevchenko. So let's break down this fight between Grasso and Shevchenko and answer the question whether Grasso's win over Shevchenko in their first fight, was it a fluke? You know, was it one of those things, you know, just one of those chaotic random moments in MMA that will be very difficult for Grasso to repeat? Or was this fight a passing of the guard where Grasso, you know, came along and basically took out the more experienced, you know, long-time dominant champion? Is Grasso, you know, is this Grasso's time? Is she the new up-and-coming champ in the flyweight division that's going to hold the belt for a while? So we're going to go through this matchup, look at a little bit of footage from their original fight, try and figure out what is going on with this one from a betting perspective, and we'll start off the process of doing all that by taking a look at the odds. So if we refresh this page just to get the latest odds here, we can see that Valentina Shevchenko is the favourite at average odds of around 1.58, which is minus 172 for an implied probability of 63%. If we take a look at the odds on Grasso, she's around an average of about, say, 2.45, which is going to be plus 145 for an implied probability of 41%. So in the eyes of the bookies, this fight very close to 60-40 in favour of Shevchenko, which is of course interesting because she lost the first fight. So very interesting how she's now the favourite, although obviously she was a far bigger favourite in the first fight, where I believe she was around a 1.10 minus 1000 favourite. I'm not sure the exact number, but I know she was an absolutely massive favourite, and Grasso's win was one of the biggest upsets by the odds in UFC history. So if we take a look at the tail of the tape, Grasso is 30 years old, 5'5" with a 66-inch reach, and Shevchenko, 35 years old, 5'5" with a 65.5-inch reach. So nothing major going on in terms of the tail of the tape. We can see that both girls roughly the same size, but we can see Shevchenko is 5 years older. Now, what's interesting about these two is that if we look at their MMA records, there's not a massive difference in the number of fights they've had. We can see Shevchenko's had 27 pro fights and Grasso has had 19. So not a huge difference. Not like Shevchenko has a massive amount of miles on the clock. And in the case of Shevchenko, obviously I don't know a lot about her Muay Thai and kickboxing career, but certainly in terms of her MMA career, it's not like she's been in a lot of wars or taken a lot of damage either. You know, she's not like, you know, a dominant champion such as someone like Max Holloway, for example, who's been in 2 wars against Volkanovski, a war against Poirier. You know, he's been in, you know, even wars dating back to earlier fights against guys like Ricardo Lamas, right, where Holloway would go toe-to-toe and play rock'em sock'em robots. So when Holloway then, you know, starts to lose a step and slip a little bit, it's not as big of a shock because he does have a lot of miles on the clock in terms of the wars he's been in, the time he spent in the octagon. But with Shevchenko, because she hasn't really taken much damage or been in many crazy wars, and to my knowledge hasn't really suffered any significant injuries, her performance, her first performance against Grasso was a little bit surprising because she didn't really fit the profile of a fighter or of a dominant champion who would start to be losing that fire. Because if we look at all dominant champions in the history of the UFC, there's a clear pattern and a clear trend that they look absolutely incredible and they look unbeatable for the longest time, and then overnight it's like they lose their fire and they just don't have that swag, they don't have that glow anymore, they don't have that confidence, they don't have that, there's just something missing. A great example of this is Israel Adesanya last weekend. I don't want to take anything away from Sean Strickland, but you know, from the very first second, Izzy just didn't look comfortable or confident in there. You know, again, no disrespect to Strickland. I bet Strickland last weekend. We live bet him. He made a lot of money. But Shevchenko doesn't really have power in his hands. He's not particularly good at making skilled strikers fight backward. He's not particularly good at cutting the cage off and crowding fighters. And yet Izzy, with amazing footwork, amazing movement, very good chin, very durable, just looked uncomfortable under the pressure that Strickland was putting on him in there. And Izzy just didn't have the same swag, the same confidence. Even before the knockdown in round one, you could see that Izzy was off. And this is just a pattern that plays out over and over and over and over again with every dominant champion. A good example before that was Kamaru Usman, right? Usman was, you know, seconds away from winning that first fight against Leon Edwards when he got caught with a head kick, and in the rematch everyone's saying all he's got to do is take Edwards down, he's going to win easily. And then he can't take Edwards down and he looks extremely bad in the rematch. I've been doing this for 14 years now. I've been making money betting on the UFC for 14 years. It's just a cycle that plays out over and over and over and over again, where you have these dominant champions like George St. Pierre, Jose Aldo, Max Holloway, think of some more examples, there's plenty of them. Chris Cyborg, right? Amanda Nunes, look at what happened in the Juliana Pena fight. Yeah, you have these dominant, bulletproof, unbeatable champions, and one day they're just not the same fighter. And they often get beat by someone far inferior to them. You know, the thought of Grasso outstriking Shevchenko before their first fight was unthinkable. You know, you look at Grasso's record, she's been involved in close fights against, you know, not necessarily close fights, but it's not like she completely dominated fighters like Ji Young Kim or Macy Barber, right, who are nowhere near the level of Valentina Shevchenko. Grasso's always got this tendency to get involved in close fights, so to see her go out and outstrike Shevchenko is quite spectacular, really. And for me, this is a really significant factor to consider in this matchup, because you have to really question whether Shevchenko has lost the fire. You know, I know during her fight week interviews this week, she's been saying that the first fight was an error, it was a mistake. She's going to correct that mistake this weekend. I think she called it an accident, and she's out there wearing camouflage and talking crazy about how her entire life depends on winning this rematch. But in my experience, I've been doing this for a really long time, when a dominant champion loses their title, particularly the older they are, and 35 years old is pretty old for a flyweight, 27 pro fights. Once they lose that title, it's very, very difficult to get their career back on track. So this is a really interesting matchup for me, because stylistically it is a pretty good fight for Shevchenko, just like their first fight was a pretty good fight. for Shevchenko, which is why she was a big favourite. But it's very foolish to ignore powerful trends. And it's a clear trend I've seen over the last 14 years where when dominant champions in their mid to late 30s lose their belt, they very, very rarely bounce back. And Kamaru Usman's a really good example of this. So, how do they match up from a stylistic point of view? Well, the good thing is this is like the easiest fight in the world ever to research, because they already fought earlier this year. So we basically got all the questions we need answered in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. If you haven't watched the fight in a long time, I would recommend going back to watch it, because your mind will play tricks on you. The reason why I spend so much time researching fights is because, you know, if you watch a fight that happened like 6 months ago, you'll have a perception of what happened in that fight in your brain, but it's almost always wrong. When you go back and watch fights in the cold light of day, you see them for what they really are, and you see what is true and what is not true. Because from memory, my recollection of this fight was that Shevchenko was very comfortable, very dominant, easily winning rounds, and Grasso was losing the fight, you know, on track to losing a decision, and she just kind of caught a Hail Mary submission like Leon Edwards style in the first fight against Usman to win the title out of nowhere. But when you watch this fight back in the cold light of day, while Shevchenko was up on the scorecards most likely, Grasso did far better than I realised. And so what's interesting about this matchup is that going into their first fight, you would have expected Shevchenko to have the advantage over Grasso everywhere. And a big part of that is the athleticism and the physicality of Shevchenko. Particularly when we're talking about women's MMA, we talk a lot about physicality and how physicality has a big impact on women's MMA fights and how it can quite often close a skill gap. So when you've got someone like Valentina, who is so skilled everywhere, but then she also has the speed, the power, the physicality, the athleticism to go with it, I mean, that's what makes her such a great fighter, such a great champion. And when you look at Grasso, she's quite slight, she's quite feminine, she doesn't really have much power in her hands, she's not particularly quick. And so prior to them fighting for the first time, you would have imagined Shevchenko would have smoked Grasso on the feet. Because even though Grasso may be able to match Valentina's volume, based on past performances prior to when they first fought, you would have been a fool for thinking that Grasso could have matched the power, the athleticism, the physicality of Shevchenko. Shevchenko's a real athlete, whereas Grasso's got that slight feminine aspect to her game. And, you know, we talk about this trend over and over again on this channel about how female fighters that have an abundance of physicality have a huge advantage in the sport. And when we think about dominant champions in the history of women's MMA, many of them have one thing in common, in that they're all, you know, they all have an abundance of physicality over most of their opponents. If you look at it, Chris Cyborg, very physically imposing. Amanda Nunes, very physically imposing, powerful. Same goes for Shevchenko. I think the only exception to the rule is probably Ronda, but she got found out pretty quickly when she ran into, you know, physically imposing athletic fighters such as Holly Holm and obviously Amanda Nunes. And so the most surprising aspect of their first fight to me when I watched it back in the cold light of day is that Grasso was actually outstriking Shevchenko and had the edge in striking. Now, I'm not going to go over that in this video because you've kind of got to watch decent chunks of the fight to realize how well Grasso does on the feet, and I don't want to make this breakdown video any longer than it needs to be. If you want to see for yourself, you don't want to take my word for it, go watch the fight. But basically, what was very surprising in this matchup is that not only did Grasso's very heavy boxing based style of striking make it very difficult for Shevchenko to get inside and land, the footwork, the movement, the head movement of Grasso was spectacular. But when Shevchenko did land, she didn't hurt Grasso at all. Like we know from Shevchenko's past fights against, fighters like Lauren Murphy or, Caitlin Chukagian, that when she would land clean and hard on these girls that couldn't match her physicality and athleticism, she would hurt them really bad, right? But Grasso would just eat her shots like they were nothing. And in the matchup, I wouldn't say Shevchenko had any kind of advantage in terms of physicality and athleticism, which was a huge shock to me. Could that be Father Time catching up on Shevchenko? Could that be just that I underrated what Grasso was capable of? Maybe a bit of both. But that was certainly a shock to me. So what's very different about coming into the rematch this weekend is that if this fight stays standing, based on the first fight, I actually favour Grasso. Because Valentina has never been one of those fighters that throws a particularly high volume of strikes. She's more of a sniper who will stand in that Muay Thai stance, light on her feet, and she'll look to either counter you or blitz you with fast combinations. But she's very much a single shot striker. And what you find in most Shevchenko fights is that girls respect how dangerous and fast she is so much that they won't really attack her too much for fear of being countered. So she doesn't really have to throw much because of that. She can kind of dictate the pace and, fight with relatively low output while still outstriking her opponents, because she doesn't need to throw a particularly high volume of strikes to outpoint most of her opponents, because they're not throwing much either. And when she does land, she's landing the harder, more impactful shots. That's where Grasso differs, because Grasso isn't intimidated by Shevchenko at all. And she's got the footwork, the head movement, the boxing to walk Shevchenko down, evade the majority of Shevchenko's shots, and get her volume striking game going to outwork Shevchenko. So unless something drastically changes from the first fight, which it might, if both girls show up and look roughly how they did last time we saw them, Grasso's got the edge on the feet. And I wouldn't expect either girl to show up having made exponential improvements, because they're not really at the stage in their careers where you would get that. Valentina, 27 pro fights, 35 years old. Grasso, 30 years old, 19 pro fights. I mean, we all look at Grasso as like this young, hungry, up-and-coming bull, but she's been around forever now. She's a veteran. We all remember the days where she was like the poster girl of Invicta. Those days were a long time ago now. And so, can you teach an old dog new tricks? Sometimes, but can you completely change an old dog's behavior? That's a lot more difficult. So, with both these girls being veterans, I wouldn't expect anything drastically different from their first fight in terms of how they match up stylistically when it comes to striking. I really feel that this fight is going to be decided by how much success Valentina can have with her grappling, because this is one area where Grasso really struggled, and the irony is that it was grappling that won Grasso the fight. But I'm going to play you some clips of their first fight now, and Shevchenko got Grasso to the ground very, very easily, was able to hold her down very, very easily, and Grasso, like in most of her fights, just had absolutely nothing off her back. Grasso is very weak off her back, doesn't make much of an effort to get back up to her feet, and Shevchenko found it easy to get her down and hold her down. Most of the time when the fight would get back up to the feet in this matchup, it was due to the ref standing them up, because to be fair, Shevchenko didn't do a whole lot from Grasso's guard. She just kind of chilled in her guard, not really doing a whole lot, so the ref would stand them up for inactivity, which I disagree with. But that's a whole other conversation we don't need to get into now. And also, I've gone blurry, so let's correct this. There we go, sharp again. Alright, so let's take a look at their first fight, and you can see how much success Shevchenko had with her grappling. So generally speaking, like I said, don't want to make this breakdown video super long, but generally speaking, Shevchenko gets outstruck and outworked in the striking exchanges. Not by a huge margin, but it happens. So all we want to do is just skip through the fight, and we want to look for those grappling sequences where you can see how easily Shevchenko gets Grasso to the ground and holds her down. So it was actually Grasso here that tried to steal the round with a takedown. But that's not what we're focusing on here, because Shevchenko, despite being submitted in the first fight, does have the edge on the ground. So here we go. So nice double leg takedown there from Shevchenko, turns the corner, and look at how easily she gets the takedown. So she passes straight into half guard, and then you can see Grasso trying to defend herself off her back with this active guard. But even though Grasso did a good job of creating a bunch of space for herself off her back, didn't really try to pop back up to her feet. So eventually, Grasso, just after failing to use these butterfly hooks, butterfly guard, to pop back up to her feet, just accepts she's not going to be able to shake Shevchenko off and just goes to full guard. This is 4 minutes left to go in round 2. So from here, Shevchenko just holds Grasso down very easily. And even though Grasso is active off her back, hasn't really got anything off her back. And Shevchenko holds her down very, very easily, till eventually Grasso's able to scramble to her knees and pop back up. So then if we skip forward a bit more, towards the end of the round, you can see again Shevchenko shoots a very nicely timed double leg, drives through, hits an outside trip, and again Grasso goes down very easily, and then Shevchenko holds her down for the rest of the round. So that's round 2. So you can kind of see there that anytime Shevchenko really commits hard to a takedown, she gets it, and when she's in top position, she is able to rack up a good amount of top control. So if we skip through this third round, and remember, in the kickboxing sequences in this fight, for the most part, Grasso is outstriking Shevchenko. You can even see some more visible damage there on Shevchenko's face. So here we go. There she feints a takedown there. Another one incoming. Level change, beautiful double leg entry, and I mean, you can't even call this takedown offense from Grasso. She practically grabs a hold of Shevchenko and pulls her on top of her. There we go. Practically pulls guard. This is the midway point through round 3, and again, Shevchenko just able to hold Grasso down very easily. Very, very easily, until the ref actually decides to stand them up, which is kind of crazy to me. Yes, Shevchenko's not doing a whole lot from top position, but ultimately, if Grasso can't work her way back up to her feet, that's her problem. It's a championship fight. Let these girls work. So now you see Shevchenko shoot another double leg. Now, this takedown is what makes me feel like Grasso may be starting to get a bit of a read on Shevchenko, because all of Shevchenko's takedown entries in this fight are very, very good. She gets in nice and deep on the legs and hips of Grasso. This is the first one, though, where Grasso kind of saw it coming and tried to sprawl out of it. Didn't do a particularly good job, but what she did do a good job of here is as soon as she hit the ground, she started trying to scramble and roll out of the takedown. Now, I would like to have seen her show a little bit more urgency to pop back up to her feet, because you can see there was a lot of space there, and she gave Shevchenko time to kind of, jump on her back and obtain this position. However, Grasso showed a lot more urgency here in this third round to work back up to her feet than she did in the first and second. So was this Grasso kind of warming up, growing into the fight, starting to get a read on Shevchenko and show a little bit more urgency to deal with that grappling? Or was that just that one singular isolated sequence? It's difficult to tell. But what is interesting is if Grasso comes out in the first round of this rematch and approaches grappling like she did in that sequence, could be far harder for Shevchenko to obtain takedowns and have success on the ground. And then this is the submission. You can see Not many takedown attempts actually from Shevchenko in this round, but she throws a spinning back kick. Grasso jumps on her back, gets the submission win. By there. Alright, so what does all this mean from a betting point of view? Well, what this means is that Shevchenko has a clear and obvious path to victory here, and for that reason she definitely deserves to be favoured. If the fight stays standing, based on the first fight, you could give Grasso a slight edge but not a huge advantage. If the fight stays standing, it's still going to be competitive and close, because in those stand-up sequences in the first fight, it wasn't like Shevchenko was getting totally outclassed. It was close competitive rounds. You saw the striking stats for round 1. I think Grasso outlanded Shevchenko something like 20 strikes to 18. And with the way that MMA judges can be, you know, rounds like that could go either way. They're a coin flip. So for me, Grasso might have a slight edge on the feet, but Shevchenko's got an enormous advantage on the ground, which again, the irony of that is that Shevchenko was submitted on the ground in the first fight. But 9 times out of 10, if you're on your back in an MMA contest, that's a losing position. And Shevchenko showed in that first fight that any time she committed hard to a takedown, she got it very easily. And so Shevchenko is a very, very tempting bet this weekend, because if she comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, it's going to be very, very difficult for Grasso to stop that based on her first fight. Now, I would like to see Shevchenko be a bit more strategic with her grappling this time. For me, Shevchenko's grappling was very erratic in the first fight. She would shoot takedowns early in a round. She would not be that active from top position, or she would only shoot 1 takedown per round on average. What I would really like to see Shevchenko do, you know, knowing that Grasso is not really capable of hurting her that much on the feet, because Grasso just doesn't have the power in her hands to do so, I would like to see Shevchenko to, you know, make more of a tactical, strategic decision to use her grappling in the second half of rounds to try and end rounds in dominant positions. I'll give you an example. In round 3, where the referee stood the map, it was because Shevchenko shot the takedown 2 minutes into round 3. So then there was like a minute and a half, 2 minutes of grappling control, and then the ref stood the map, a minute left to go in the round. If Shevchenko would have waited to shoot that takedown until 2 minutes left to go in round 3, it would have been far harder for the ref to stand them up, because there wasn't as much time left in the round, which would have given Shevchenko an opportunity to end the round in a dominant position, which means even if she would have got outstruck in the first 3 minutes of round 3, she likely still would have won the third round. For me, Shevchenko is a great champion, very skilled fighter, but it's tactical, strategic mistakes like that that can cost you. And if she makes those adjustments for this rematch, it makes life a lot harder for Alexa Grasso. So what does all this mean from a betting point of view? For me personally, it means that Shevchenko is an extremely tempting bet. She showed in that first fight that she's got a clear and obvious path to victory, and it doesn't matter that Grasso may have a slight advantage on the feet, because if she's going to be spending the majority of this fight on her back, that stand-up advantage doesn't really help her all that much. But there are major risk factors with betting Shevchenko this weekend that do make me reluctant to pull the trigger on her. The first reason is that Grasso doesn't really have any surprises coming into this rematch. You know, based on the first fight, I think Grasso can be pretty comfortable that she's going to be all right on the feet. I don't see what major changes Shevchenko could do to make life significantly harder for Grasso when it comes to striking. And so that means that in the lead up to this fight, Grasso's going to know that the only way she's really going to lose this rematch is if Shevchenko's able to take her down and hold her down. And so Grasso knows exactly what she needs to work on here. And she's also had the benefit of being in the octagon for 20 minutes with Shevchenko to feel her out. You know, to see her takedown entries come in, to feel what she's like on the ground. And so if Grasso's been working on her takedown defense, maybe not even her takedown offense, but her ability to work her way back up to her feet. You know, if Grasso's now one of these fighters that if you take her down, she can quickly pop back up, this is going to be a really difficult fight for Shevchenko, because what Grasso did show in that first fight was that when she was getting taken down, my nose has gone really itchy, when she was getting taken down, she was doing a really good job of creating a lot of space for herself as she initially hit the ground. And the one mistake she made is not showing urgency in those sequences to just scramble back up. I always use the example of Team Alpha Male fighters to illustrate this point. If we think about the Uriah Fabers, the Chad Mendezes, the Josh Emmetts, the TJ Dillashaws, the Cody Garbrandts, if you go and look at what all those guys do when they get taken down, as soon as they hit the ground, they immediately look to explode back up to their feet. They look to use any little bit of space you give them to get back up. The problem, or the mistake that Grasso made in that first fight, was that when she got taken down, she would just hesitate. Say she created space with her active guard, she would continue with the active guard and create more space instead of using that little bit of space, that window of opportunity, to pop back up. And that then enabled Shevchenko to drive through on whatever she was trying to do, either complete a takedown or take half guard or go into her full guard and establish a dominant position. So what I see from both these girls coming into this rematch this weekend is, in terms of their skills, there's not a whole lot that I think they need to do differently. I just think they need to make tactical, strategic adjustments. Shevchenko needs to be more intelligent around when she uses her grappling, and Grasso needs to show more urgency when put in bad positions. The fact that those dynamics are, or the fact that those things are pretty easy for both girls to do, makes this a very interesting fight, because those tiny adjustments from either or both girls could make this fight a lot more difficult for the other. If Grasso shows more urgency to pop back up to her feet this time, the matchup becomes exponentially more difficult for Shevchenko. But if Shevchenko uses her grappling to steal rounds, with how bad Grasso's takedown defense has looked, it's going to be difficult for Grasso to win rounds against Shevchenko. It's a very, very complex fight on that front. Other risk factors with betting Shevchenko in this matchup, on top of adjustments that both girls could make or could not make, would be she's getting old, man. She's getting old. The rematch for Kamaru Usman against Leon Edwards looked like, pretty straightforward for him, clear and obvious path to victory, and he looked worse than ever. He looked worse than the first fight. Israel Adesanya last weekend, looked like he'd lost the fire. And even though Shevchenko's saying all the right things in the Fight Week interviews this week, in my experience doing this for 14 years, when the fire burns out, very, very difficult to reignite it. And so that's a big red flag in this one. So this is one of those bets, those fights I haven't really made my mind up on yet. Because when you look at their first fight and you see how much success Shevchenko had with her grappling, it does make Shevchenko an extremely, extremely, extremely tempting bet. But I just don't love it. I don't love it. I want to be betting on young, hungry, up and coming bulls that are, that have still got the fire burning inside them, and that might not be the case with Shevchenko anymore. Let me know what you think in Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm not sure. Haven't made my mind up. A little bit like Benoit Saint-Denis a few weeks ago, where when I did the breakdown video, I hadn't made my mind up, and then I ended up betting him after seeing the weigh-ins. I'm just not ready to make my mind up on this one, which is why the breakdown videos are a little bit late this week. I'd like to make my mind up and tell you guys exactly what I'm going to do before I put these breakdowns out. And I've just been going back and forth on the Grasso-Shevchenko fight all week, trying to decide what to do. And I'm not really sure yet. I haven't made my mind up, and I put a lot of thought into this shit, so I don't know. We've only had 2 losing months on loose pre-fight bets in the whole of 2023, and we're just performing amazing this year. And so, when I place bets, I want to love them, and I don't love Shevchenko. I don't love a bet on Shevchenko. So yeah, I'm not sure about this one yet. Obviously, if you're a member of my community, if you're a member of my website, I'll let you guys know what I decide to do before the fight takes place. Obviously, in the Discord channel. If you're not a member of my website, then let me know what you think in the comments below, man. Let me know. So yeah, not sure about this one. Shevchenko's very tempting. I wouldn't be betting Grasso with how weak her takedown defense looked, but very, very tempted by the bet on Shevchenko. Anyway, in terms of the over-under on this matchup, I do think it's very likely this fight goes to a decision. If you look at their records, Grasso is a decisionator. Valentina, also many of her fights go deep. And so with how tough and well-rounded both these girls are, pretty likely this fight goes to a decision. I'm not going to be betting it because I don't like to bet on fights to go to a decision in 5-rounders. 25 minutes in a cage fight to the death is a long time. But I do think it's more likely this one goes to a decision if you do want to bet the over-under this weekend. In terms of props, the only one I would consider is Shevchenko by decision. But the odds are absolutely terrible. So that's not something I'm going to be betting myself. But if you like to bet props, you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on every fight to make watching more interesting. Shevchenko by decision, 2.50 plus 150 or whatever is probably your best prop. So I hope you found that useful. And don't forget, if you want me to do a live stream where we break down next week's main event between Rafael Fiziev and Mateusz Gamrot, don't forget to hit the like button below. If we get 150 likes, I'll be doing our live stream on Monday on YouTube. And let me just have a little drinky poo of water. We'll get into the next one. Alrighty then. Alright. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is an amazing fight. Could have been a main event in itself. Jack Della Maddalena and Kevin Holland. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Jack Della Maddalena is the favourite at average odds of around 1.65, which is minus 154 for an implied probability of 61%. If you take a look at the odds on Kevin Holland, he is around an average of 2.25, which is plus 125 for an implied probability of 44%. So Jack Della Maddalena is 27 years old, 5'11", with a 73-inch reach. And Kevin Holland is 30 years old, 6'3", with an 81-inch reach. So we can see that both guys roughly the same age, but there is a massive 8-inch reach advantage for Kevin Holland, which statistically gives him around a 70% chance of winning, 7-0. So when a fighter has an 8-inch reach advantage over their opponent, they win around 70% of the time. So that is one strong trend going against Jack Della Maddalena this weekend, even though he is a big favourite. Now, you guys know, if you watch my breakdown videos every week, I am a pretty big critic of Kevin Holland. I think his fight IQ is questionable, to say the very least, at times, and it's very rare that I favour him in fights. So what's particularly interesting about this matchup is when I first looked at all the fights taking place this weekend, Jack Della Maddalena was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet. But after researching this one, I actually leaned towards Kevin Holland, which I never ever expected to happen. I thought I would be betting Jack Della Maddalena this weekend, but after researching it, I think this is a potentially very, very good stylistic matchup for Kevin Holland. So let's break down how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. Let's get grappling out the way to start off with. So what's real interesting about this matchup is that grappling is obviously the weakness for both guys. We saw Jack Della Maddalena's takedown defense and ground game get exposed a bit in his last fight against Basel Hafez, where he looked extremely low level on the ground against someone that was literally just stepping up to take the fight on just a few days' notice. And of course, Kevin Holland in his fights against guys like Marvin Vettori, Derek Brunson, showed us that, you know, his takedown defense isn't great. He's quite weak off his back as well. However, if this fight were to go to the ground, this is one of those very, very rare situations where Kevin Holland is going to have the advantage. He's got long, skinny arms, skinny legs, which he can use to tie his opponents up in difficult positions on the ground. He's got nasty chokes, and he's shown that he's reasonably dangerous on the ground with his submission game. With how low level Maddalena looked on the ground against Hafez, I think if these guys did go to the ground, Holland is so active with his submission game, so active off his back, that he would cause Maddalena big problems. So this is one of those rare examples where Holland, or rare fights where Holland's got the edge on the ground. I don't expect this fight to go to the ground, but if it did, you've got to give Holland the edge. I mean, submitting Chiesa in his last fight was extremely impressive. We know Chiesa's ground game very, very good. If Holland would have submitted Chiesa, late in the fight when Chiesa was too tired to defend himself, fair enough. But he actually submitted him in round 1 when both guys were fresh. Super, super, super impressive, because we know Chiesa is levels and levels and levels and levels above a guy like Jack Della Maddalena on the ground. But obviously both these guys are predominantly strikers, so you would expect this to be a stand-up fight. And if this does stay standing, it's a really interesting clash of styles. What I really like about this matchup is that both guys are probably going to be able to fight in the range that they like to fight in. Jack Della Maddalena is one of these guys that likes to walk you down, put a lot of pressure on you, and basically back you up against the cage, trap you in an uncomfortable range, and force you to go toe-to-toe with him, play rock'em sock'em robots, and get into these big boxing exchanges. Kevin Holland, on the other hand, has got great footwork, great movement, and he likes to stay on the outside and use his length and chip away at you and counter-strike from a safe distance. And that style, or that clash of styles, means both guys are probably going to get what they want here, because Holland won't mind Maddalena walking him down, so that he can play the role of Matador and pick Maddalena off as he comes forward. And Maddalena will like that he can lead the dance, because that's what he wants to do. That's what he always does. So in terms of how they match up, in terms of striking, what's interesting about this one is Maddalena is a better boxer than Kevin Holland. Maddalena's real strength is in his hands. We know he's got great combinations, great body work, very technical, a lot of power in his hands. Holland's boxing isn't great. He's more of a kicker, and he uses his length very well. His kicking game is very good. However, Holland's boxing isn't terrible. It might not be as good as Maddalena's. He might not hit as hard as Maddalena's. His combinations might not be as sharp and technical as Maddalena's. But that 8-inch reach advantage and Holland's footwork and movement could potentially really close that skill gap, because it's not going to be easy for someone like Maddalena with a very boxing-based style of fighting to close the distance and get inside on someone as long, rangy, and as elusive as Kevin Holland. I would give Maddalena the advantage offensively between the two in this fight. I think Maddalena is the better, more dangerous striker in this fight. However, Holland's elusiveness, his footwork, his movement, his defense potentially makes him a very, very tricky stylistic matchup. The thing that really differentiates these two is the defense. Maddalena is one of these guys. I mean, you just look at his face, right? This guy is not alien to taking some big shots, to taking some big damage in fights. What Maddalena likes to do is come forward, take control of the center of the octagon, stand right in front of you, trap you in an uncomfortable range, and force you to exchange with him. And he's very, very good in that phone booth range, in the pocket. The problem is when you're fighting someone like Holland that is very good at making themselves a moving target, that has that 8-inch reach, has got great footwork and movement. When you come forward and try to trap this guy in an uncomfortable range, he's probably not going to be there, like past opponents such as Danny Roberts or Pete Rodriguez or Randy Brown, because these kind of guys that Della Maddalena have been facing are more likely to panic under the pressure that he puts on them. So if you come forward and you walk a guy like Danny Roberts or Randy Brown down, you can trap him in that uncomfortable range and they'll just feel overwhelmed, and that's when you can get to work with your combinations and landing your big power shots. We also saw Hafez struggle to get his back off the cage in his last fight. Holland, on the other hand, has got that footwork, that movement, that side-to-side lateral movement. And the one thing about Holland is when he's moving around you with his footwork, he can also land and outpoint you and outstrike you and play the role of Matador. He can land his long punches, his jabs, his leg kicks from the outside. So this is one of those fights where it's potentially very, very difficult for Maddalena, because Holland can land on Maddalena from a range where Maddalena is going to have to put himself in a lot of danger and cover a lot of distance to fire back. And that makes this fight real interesting for me. So the reason why I lean Holland in this fight is because He's better defensively than Maddalena by an order of magnitude. He's got the advantage on the ground. Based on the Hafez fight, he's got better cardio as well. And with the 8-inch reach advantage and the footwork and movement, I think he can frustrate Maddalena and make it very, very difficult for Maddalena to get inside and land anything. Obviously, Maddalena will land. He's a very high-level striker, but at what cost? Is he going to be eating big counters and getting picked off, you know, while kind of stalking Holland around the octagon, trying to cut the cage off and close the distance? I think Holland can inflict a lot of damage on Maddalena, you know, by using his length, his footwork and movement. And I think Maddalena is going to have to absorb a lot of damage to get close enough to Holland to get his shots off, and that won't be easy. So I do quite like Holland in this fight. If it wasn't for his fight IQ, the fact that he just can't be trusted, I would probably bet him. So yeah, let me know what you think in Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Very, very interesting fight. My lean is Holland, and I didn't expect that to be the case. In terms of the over-under on this one, I do think it's quite likely the fight goes deep just because of how tough they are. Now, both guys are very dangerous as well, but they are both durable. They have got very good chins. We've seen, you know, Kevin Holland in some absolute wars against, you know, the likes of Stephen Thompson, for example. We know he can take a shot. We know Maddalena's tough as nails as well. I do quite like the over 1.5 rounds on this fight, and I might be betting that myself. In terms of the prop bets, Holland by decision at 5.0 plus 400, pretty interesting to me. I won't be betting that myself because I don't like props, but if you're the type of guy that likes to bet props to make watching the fight more interesting, Holland by decision is what I would go with, just because both these guys are very, very tough. Won't be easy to get either of them out of there. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Raul Rosas Jr. versus Terence Mitchell. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Rosas is an absolutely massive favourite. Average odds are about 1.13, which is going to be minus 769 for an implied probability of 89%. If we take a look at the odds on Terence Mitchell, he's around an average of 6.30, which is going to be plus 530 for an implied probability of 16%. So Mitchell, 33 years old, 5'10". We don't know what his reach is. Rosas Jr., 18 years old, 5'9", with a 67-inch reach. So massive age gap here. I'm not even going to bother with the age statistics though, because they're not really relevant to this fight. Mitchell isn't at that stage in his career where you'd expect him to be declining. But Rosa at 18 years old should be making huge improvements from fight to fight. And I'm sure he will have learned a lot from his loss in his last fight against Christian Rodriguez. In many ways, it's very, very difficult to form a strong opinion on this matchup because we don't know a whole lot about Terence Mitchell. If you look at his record, we can see that every single one of his fights dating back to 2014 has ended very, very quickly. So every single one of his fights dating back to, or every single one of his fights over the last 8, 9 years have ended in round 1. So we don't really know what Mitchell's cardio is like. We don't know a whole lot about his grappling. We don't really know much about his striking either. What we do know about Raul Rosas Jr. is that he is a pretty skilled grappler, good offensive wrestler, good grappling control, very, very good on the ground. Now, we saw flashes of Mitchell's grappling in his last fight against Cameron Simon, where he basically shot for a takedown early in that fight, got reversed, just basically dominated on the ground by Simon. Mitchell's ground game didn't look very good at all in that matchup against Simon. So with how strong of a grappler Raul Rosas Jr. is, Rosas Jr. probably going to be able to get this fight to the ground and cause Mitchell big problems. But there is a big lack of footage on Mitchell, and we don't know a whole lot about him. So can't feel all too confident that that Rosas is going to have his own way here. But, you know, with how bad Mitchell looked on the ground against Simon, probably going to be an easy night's work for Rosas. Obviously, his odds are completely unplayable, though, with him being such a big favourite and with there being so many unanswered questions on Mitchell, and also with Rosas being very inexperienced at only 18 years old. You'd have to be crazy to bet Rosas Jr. in this fight. Why does that keep happening? It's very, very irritating. But at the same time, with how bad Mitchell looked on the ground against Simon, you wouldn't really want to be betting him, at these odds either. In terms of the over-under on this one, again, because there's not a whole lot of footage available on Mitchell, difficult to get a read on the likelihood of this fight going deep, and same goes for props. So this is a bit of a dead fight from a betting point of view. You already know that, guys. You don't need me to say that. So yeah, that fight is a very easy pass. Let's move on to the next one. So now let's break down the fight between Daniel Zellhuber and Christos Giagos. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see the Zellhuber is the favourite at average odds of around 1.36, which is going to be minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. We take a look at the odds on Giagos, he's around an average of 3.25, which is going to be plus 225 for an implied probability of 31%. So Zellhuber, 24 years old, 6'1" with a 77-inch reach, and Giagos, 33 years old, 5'10" with a 71-inch reach. So no major X factors on this one other than the size and reach of Zellhuber. In terms of age, yes, Giagos has had 30 pro fights. He's 33 years old. It's a lot of fights for a 33-year-old in the lightweight division, but he hasn't really been showing signs of decline, in my opinion. Giagos is just the same guy he's always been, from my perspective. In a couple more years, maybe Giagos starts to decline, but for now, no major red flags in terms of him declining, although Zellhuber, at only 24 years old, should be making big improvements from fight to fight. There is also a 9-year age gap in this fight, and we know that the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. So that's a very strong trend in Zellhuber's favour. We can also see another trend in Zellhuber's favour. Not only is he a little bit taller than Giagos, but he also has a pretty big 6-inch reach advantage, which statistically gives him around a 65% chance of winning. So before we even get into talking about how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, we can see a couple strong trends in Zellhuber's favour with the age, with the reach stats in his favour. Now, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, it's a classic striker versus grappler matchup. Zellhuber, the striker, Giagos, the grappler. But it is a pretty good stylistic matchup for Zellhuber because, as we know, Giagos is one of these guys that does tend to slow down a lot as fights wear on. What's interesting about this matchup is that I'd actually go as far as saying that Giagos is better than Zellhuber everywhere. I think he's a better MMA striker. He's definitely a better MMA grappler than Zellhuber. But the problem with Giagos is that he tends to slow down pretty badly after round 1, whereas Zellhuber has got the gas tank to go hard for 3 rounds. So if this fight stays standing, Zellhuber's got that technical kickboxing style. He does use his length pretty well, but Giagos moves very well. He hits very hard. He's also a technical striker. I think Giagos is probably going to do pretty well early on. Probably going to cause Zellhuber some problems early on the feet. Giagos, though, when it comes to his grappling, is in a tricky position where you very rarely see him grapple because he knows the more he grapples, the faster he gets tired. So Giagos is one of these guys that doesn't grapple that often for risk of gassing himself out. So even though he does have pretty big advantage on the ground against Zellhuber, I wouldn't expect him to use it all that much. So this is one of those really strange fights where Giagos can hold his own and do pretty well against Zellhuber everywhere, but his cardio is so bad that he's probably going to struggle in the second half of this fight no matter how he approaches it. And what I do like about Zellhuber is that he is aggressive, he does throw a high volume of strikes, and he does fight at quite a high pace. We know that his fight on the Contender Series, as an example, was an absolute war against Lucas Almeida, and he kind of outworked Lucas Almeida after Lucas Almeida came out really strong in that fight. So this is one of those matchups where it's tough to bet Zellhuber at these odds because Giagos is well-rounded, he is very skilled, he is very dangerous. Zellhuber is young and inexperienced. Not very attractive to bet Zellhuber at big favourite odds, but on the other side of the coin, Zellhuber's got that Latin American gas tank. He's reasonably well-rounded. He fights at a high pace. And those kind of guys tend to be kryptonite for people like Giagos. Because we know if Giagos doesn't get you out of there early, he usually fades very hard in the second half of fights. Which means he's probably going to struggle pretty bad in the second half of the fight against Zellhuber. So round 1's probably going to be pretty competitive here. Round 2 could go either way. Round 3, Zellhuber's almost certainly going to win. I think it's just going to come down to how that second half of round 2 looks and whether Giagos has got enough in the tank to steal it. It's going to be an interesting fight, but from a betting point of view, very, very difficult to bet. Odds probably where they should be. In terms of the over-under on this one, though, this is another fight where I do quite like the over 1.5 rounds. Both guys very, very tough. We can see Zellhuber's last 3 fights have gone to a decision. We can see that Giagos, even though a lot of his fights have ended inside the distance, before that he was also quite the decisionator. So I think just a little bit of variance here with a lot of his fights recently ending inside the distance. Both these guys are very tough and difficult to finish. Giagos is one of these fighters that because he gasses in every fight, he doesn't panic when he gets tired. And so it's not easy to get him out of there even when he is absolutely exhausted. So I think there's a pretty good chance this fight goes deep. And I do like the over 1.5 rounds. I'll probably be betting that. And in terms of the prop bets on this fight, Zellhuber by decision is the most likely outcome because it's not easy to get Giagos out of there. Another one would be Zellhuber to win in round 3, but not all that likely to hit because, again, it isn't easy to get Giagos out of there. And to be fair to Zellhuber, he's not that dangerous. He's more of a volume striker, which is why you can see his last 3 fights have gone to a decision. So I won't be betting those props myself. I don't like props, but if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching more interesting, Zellhuber in round 3, Zellhuber by decision are some options for you. Zellhuber by decision, the most likely outcome on this fight, in my opinion. I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the final fight on this main card, which is going to be Fernando Padilla against Carl Nelson. So there are a lot of fighters that I'm tempted to bet on this card. Shevchenko is one of them. Kevin Holland is another one of them. There are a few others as well on the prelims. And Carl Nelson is also a fighter that I am tempted to bet for the reasons that I'll explain in this breakdown. So we can see that Padilla is a reasonably big favourite. The average odds are around 1.40, which is minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. We take a look at the odds on Carl Nelson. He's around an average of 3.0, which is going to be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Padilla is going to be, is 26 years old, 6'1", with a 76-inch reach. And Kyle Nelson, 32 years old, 5'11", with a 71-inch reach. So no major X factors in terms of age. But we've talked a lot about reach advantages on this card, and we can see that Padilla has a very nice 5-inch reach advantage, which statistically gives him around about a 65% chance of winning this fight. So very nice to have a 5-inch reach advantage in this matchup. So what is super interesting about this matchup from a stylistic point of view is that Kyle Nelson is one of these fighters that is making exponential improvements from fight to fight. Every time we see him, he looks exponentially better than he did before. So while I would expect Padilla to be making big improvements from fight to fight with him only being 26 years old, I'd also be expecting Carl Nelson to be making another improvement since we last saw him against Blake Builder. And of course, you know, Nelson was a relatively low-level guy, you know, earlier in his UFC career. He was one of these guys that would quit when put in bad positions. He would gas very badly. But in his last 2 fights against Doo Ho Choi and Blake Builder, his cardio's looked a lot better. He's looked a lot more aggressive, a lot more well-rounded. His output has been a lot higher, and he's a hell of a lot better than he used to be. So, in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, it is a very, very interesting one. Now, both guys are primarily strikers, so let's quickly cover the grappling, because I do think grappling is an area where Nelson potentially has an advantage in this fight. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Padilla's grappling. If you take a look at his record, the majority of his fights since sort of 2019, over the last 4 years, have either ended quickly or involved a whole lot of striking. So we don't know tons about Padilla's grappling. We've seen flashes of it. Really good. And it's possible that Nelson could have a big advantage on the ground. We know that Nelson has got good takedown entries, good deep double leg takedowns. He's a strong, powerful, physically imposing guy. If he's able to get this fight to the ground, he could have a lot of success against Padilla. And like I say, we don't know a whole lot about Padilla's ground game, which makes it difficult to quantify the level of advantage Nelson may have on the ground. But it's certainly worth considering that Nelson may have the edge if this fight were to go to the ground. We can't get absolute confirmation of that due to a lack of footage, but I have a feeling if this fight did go to the ground, Padilla could be in a reasonable amount of trouble. Now, if the fight stays standing, it's a very interesting clash of styles, because Padilla, for the most part, is a high-volume striker, and Nelson is much more of a single-shot striker, but he has huge power, and everything he lands is big, hard, and impactfulness. He's got devastating leg kicks, big power in his hands, and when he throws and lands, he inflicts big damage. Out of the two, Padilla's footwork, movement, defense is a lot better than Nelson's. Nelson isn't particularly good defensively, and he's not going to be able to match the volume that Padilla is going to be able to throw out there. However, Nelson hits like a truck, and Padilla is a little bit reckless at times. He does back himself to win big exchanges, and he does get sucked into big exchanges. And getting into big exchanges against a guy like Nelson isn't a great idea because of how hard this guy hits. So Nelson's definitely the more powerful, definitely the more dangerous out of the two. But he will struggle to match Padilla's volume. Now, the reason why I'm strongly considering a bet on Nelson in this fight is because not only do I suspect he has the advantage on the ground, but on top of that, Padilla is also really aggressive. He's one of these guys that likes to come out, take control of the center of the octagon, get in your face, and force you to exchange. And when you force guys like Nelson to exchange, it's a very dangerous game to play because of how powerful he is. When Nelson bites down on his mouthpiece and comes out swinging, he can inflict a lot of damage, he can knock you out. And like I say, he's a very dangerous guy. Padilla's one of these guys that doesn't use his length particularly well, doesn't really move his head all that much, and doesn't really show his opponents much respect. If you look at his last fight, he literally came out all guns blazing, playing Rock'em Sock'em Robots with Julian Erosa, and it worked out for him. He got the knockout, but it's a whole different ball game, you know, fighting reckless against a fellow volume striker like Julian Erosa compared to doing that against someone that hits as hard as Kyle Nelson. So I am probably going to pass on this fight this weekend. Nelson would be a risky underdog, but I do think he's a very live underdog in this fight, and I do think he could cause Padilla big problems. So if we take a look at the over-under on this matchup, I wouldn't be touching the over-under on this one. I could see it go both ways. On one hand, it's very likely the fight ends inside the distance. I understand why that is favoured, because Padilla is so aggressive that he will initiate action. And when you've got a fighter that initiates action, when he's constantly attacking his opponent, something's got to give, right? So if he comes forward, walks Nelson down, forces Nelson into big exchanges, someone's going to get knocked out because Nelson won't want to take a backward step, and neither will Padilla. So it is more likely the fight ends inside a decision, or it doesn't go to a decision, but the odds are so steep they just don't interest me. Not a great deal of upside in betting that. In terms of the props, Nelson by decision 7.5 plus 650, that's interesting to me, especially because if he were to use a grappling heavy game plan, he may be able to lay and pray Padilla to a decision win. So that's quite interesting to me. I won't be betting him myself, but those odds are pretty generous to me. I do think there's a pretty good amount of value there. So I hope you found that useful. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you like these breakdowns, you want to watch my breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card, head on over to my website, MMABettingTips.com, where you'll find all my bets on our Discord channel, as well as breakdown videos for every single prelim on every single UFC card. And if you want me to do that that live stream for Mateusz Gamrot, Rafael Fiziev next week, hit the like button. If we get 150 likes, we'll get it going. So thank you very much for watching, and Nice one, guys. Have a great weekend. Hope you crush it. Take care. I'll see you all very soon. Nice one, guys. Bye.